Okay, tough, up against it, and everybody's hungry, grumbling, I know. We'll be efficient, but hopefully this will be an interesting one, not too hard on your brains right before lunch. Objective really is to just leave a, oh, I pushed it on accident. Oh, perfect. Leave a rock in your shoe, right? So we're not, as Jon kind of teed it up for us, like we're not answering all the questions about resilience, but want to get us thinking about that. My brain's going all different ways going last because I feel like we've talked about resilience like repeatedly through the different presentations, and I'm listening to Jen's. I'm like, oh yeah, that, I'll work that in. But now we're time limited and I'll push start, so I can't work all that in. And so it's helpful. So just what we're gonna walk through, intro, this idea of psychological resilience, definition of terms, really. When you think of resilience, real quick, popcorn synonyms that pop out, what do you got? Grit. Tough. Flexible, I like that. Bounce back. Adaptable. Perseverance sometimes comes up. Do what?
Not crazy.
Not crazy. The absence of crazy. Okay, I like that. Yeah, I haven't read that study. I'll keep my eyes peeled. But so I'll jump into that and offer some clarification on resilience. I think it might end up a little bit falling into that category of the old, I can't really define it clearly, but I know it when I see it. And a lot of times with resilience, there's studies out there and psychologists dedicated to, grit. I'm thinking of Duckworth that I brought up with before. She's got some great stuff on grit. And trying to predict who's going to be resilient is tricky because we don't know if they're resilient or not until after the fact. And so it's kind of this, post-mortem analysis on who had resilience and who didn't. Hopefully no mortem part with what we're doing. But and then what does that look like as we contrast professional versus private and the commercial space? And so, and is resilience required? So we're going to look at some of those questions. Chip's going to talk about unique challenges, and then going to introduce a unique variable and theory he's working on, and I'm happy to be able to be a part helping him develop that some. But this idea of Earth attachment, and what does that mean? How does it play into resilience? And you can just push it for me. Okay. Leave those quotes up there for you. Nietzsche, sometimes you see what doesn't kill you makes you stronger is like this inspirational thing. I would argue that needs to be, that's his statement about himself, which would reflect some resilience, right? For him, what doesn't kill him makes him stronger. The idea of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger remains to be seen. What doesn't kill you could make you stronger. So that's kind of resilience mentality. But I will say, Frankl, he's a psychiatrist, World War II, Man's Search for Meaning. If you haven't read it, you should. It's a great study. His focus was on injecting meaning and purpose into suffering and how that gets us through that and to the other side. There's an element of resilience there. Because ultimately, this idea of resilience is, yes, perseverance, but not just perseverance. Yes, grit, but maybe not just grit, but it's getting through a thing and then having improved or find yourself better for it on the other side, which is a unique status. When I think resilience, it might seem kind of MacGyver, right? MacGyver never finds himself in a situation where things have gone wrong and he's hopeless and despondent and he's not going to get out of it. I mean, somehow he finds a way. And it's kind of this embodiment of resilience where the circumstances don't defeat, but really kind of inspire the creativity that's needed to find a way through, out of the circumstance. In our working group, both times, resilience kind of bubbles up to the top of the discussion. And I'm struck by, we have an opportunity, OSMED, and just as space travel continues to evolve, to have that to create a culture of resiliency, really. I mean, so the people that come through, whether they're professional or private, but especially as we think about the private and the LEO space and going even further in this idea of resilience, I think everybody would agree is, especially for the longer duration stuff, it's going to be required. We can persevere through a hard thing for a short time, but resilience, the idea of like encountering setbacks and adversity and then having to figure out our way through them, that's going to be required the longer and longer that we're further and further away. And so the idea of incorporating design, both from an engineering perspective and otherwise, to the extent that we can always keep in the back of our minds the question of how is what I'm engineering, how is what I'm designing, be it a protocol or actual physical space. It might seem silly, but it's important to keep the question, how is this fostering a culture of resilience? How is this hypothetically inspiring in the person that's going to be utilizing it or inhabiting the space? How is it setting them up for that like resilient response to adversity? Okay, we kind of touched on some of this. Images that come to mind. Is it a prerequisite? Let's see. I've got 5 minutes. I'm going to tell it really fast. So part of the, when I was reading through the OSMED objective and this circling back to storytelling, and then I was thinking, all right, resilience, what good stories do I have for resilience? And the first story that comes to mind is a personal one, but I think for me anyway, it was like, oh, that does highlight it. And so great-grandfather, Frenchman, born in Dunkirk, north of France, almost to Belgium. Dunkirk, later on, very famous for the big evacuation, but this is 1892 when he's born. And so it predates that. Jean Lozac, he moves from Dunkirk, moves west in France, ends up north of France, a Mason, doing his thing, doing well. World War I. Called back to the east of France, trenches overdone, not very pretty, injured, pulled back, convalesces, goes back, spends more time, survives. And I'm grateful for that. So he perseveres. He endures this hard thing, and he does survive. Back to home, back to Mason, but becomes an incredibly abusive alcoholic, and it doesn't go well for him. Underachieves, resentful, bitter. You could argue he persevered, he endured, he survived, he didn't die. But was resilience really like a highlight of that experience? And no, it wasn't at that point. A part of what we'll get to is I think resilience is on some level on a continuum. We ended up hitting the word readiness in our group at one point. And that's also a continuum, right? It can vary from day to day. And I think a person can maybe not be resilient in one setting or in one moment, but as we evolve and adapt, which we'll touch on what Chip talks about, resilience can be fostered. And so fast forward about, so that's 19 teens. And so then my grandmother, born in 25, 17 years old, of course, World War II. So in come the Nazis, and northern France is not their own anymore. She has a couple of brothers. They're part of the French underground. SS catches word that they're involved in that. They escape across the channel to England, but the SS knows where they live, so they come knocking. So they show up to the house. You've got my grandfather, my great-grandfather, the one that previously told you about, who struggling, but he's still the primary breadwinner of the family. My grandmother's there with her multiple siblings, and the SS says, we're taking him. And so she steps up and says, no, don't take him, take me. And they say, okay. And so 16, 17 years old, they take her. And train ride across France. She doesn't know where she's going, ends up in northern Germany, Nazi work camp, 2 years there. But just assortment of political prisoners and people from all over the European world anyway at that point. Survives. The story she tells, one morning they wake up, all the guards are unlocking all the barracks for the prisoners. They're jumping in their jeeps, they're driving down the road. The prisoners are looking around. What are we doing here? Over the hill rolled a Where's Farhan? Roll the Canadian paratroopers. So kudos to Canada on that one. And liberate the camp. And so she's persevered. Lots of little stories of being resilient while she was there. Because they get there, and of course they're looking at them like, what do we do? And they're like, sorry, we got to keep going this way, but you guys are free. And they're like, well, where are we? And so, as opposed to just sitting down and being done, starts working her way west, hiding in farmhouses, eggs, stealing random. She has all sorts of stories of making her way back, all the way back to Paris, catches a train, back up to Normandy, where they're from, knocks on the door. Mom opens the door, hits the ground, thinks it's a ghost. They thought she was long gone. It was 2 years later. Many more stories after that of how my grandmother, ends up American GI, marries, comes to the States, lots of adversity, continues to overcome that. And it seems to have been that, she wasn't just focused on, I'm not going to die. She did not die, but then she also had this other mentality that was, I'm not going to let this defeat me. I'm not going to let them rob the life that I'd been planning on having. And she ends up living that out. And it's a kind of a guiding principle for her to where she encounters these moments of adversity and she has a bigger purpose that helps her to then problem solve her way through that. And yes, persevere, but persevere in a way that keeps improving, keeps moving her towards that ultimate goal. As we think about private versus commercial and resilience, I know I'm kind of all over the place. Like I said, I got a lot of thoughts spinning around. But part of historically what we've done is, we'll use personality measures, and there's nothing wrong with those, but we're using screening measures to weed out the crazy, to use someone else's word, to have the optimal group going. And anything that's suboptimal, we're weeding that out, weeding that out, weeding that out. And so we get an elite group that are very capable of persevering, and it works well, and they do persevere. But the question remains, when it's not the elite group, when we're maybe not going to use those to screen everybody out, what are going to be the traits? Since we're not going to say you have that history or your personality is not quite optimal, you're not going to go. But no, we're going to take you. Okay, so now how do we foster this culture both within the team and in the prep that ultimately, I think, a very high on the list need is how do we prep them to be resilient, both within the team and individually as they do short mission and then ultimately longer and longer mission. Don't have as much time to talk about one of my faves, self-determination theory and causality orientation that I think it ties it some to what Chip's going to talk about in terms of attachment and just the optimal psychological status of autonomy, competence, and relatedness would be self-determination theory, and causality in terms of, how much power do I have to affect change in my space? How much am I just a victim of my circumstances? Obviously, the former is going to be the resilience correlate as opposed to a person that really just feels like there's nothing that I can do to get past or through this. So we don't have, like I said, we're leaving a rock in your shoe. So there can be questions that are left unanswered. But we want to get you thinking about this idea of resilience and how do we incorporate that into all the aspects of what we're doing. Because I do think that to the extent that we can foster a culture of resilience in the people that are either volunteering or paying their way, but ultimately they're going to be placed in an environment that, as Chip will talk about, does not like them and is seeking to, if we let it and we aren't resilient, we'll destroy them ultimately. How do we help that person have the optimism that's needed to endure? Skip through. Tag out. I think I kept it pretty close to 15.
Jon is a hard act to follow, and this is kind of like a Monty Python skit, now for something completely different. So what I want to introduce is we've got a lot of problems that we need to solve. We have this long list of challenges, but a short list of solutions right now, and that's good because that means we have a lot of work to do to make that environment, the on-orbit environment in space, not just an environment that's designed for survival, but an environment where individuals can thrive. But if you think about some of the challenges and some of the threats, we know that space is inherently hostile for human physiology, and especially the central nervous system. Microgravity is a primary driver of CNS changes due to the absence of the normal gravitational cues and associated bodily fluid shifts, a cephalad shift, certain conditions that you're aware of, like SANS changes in intracerebral pressure, changes in proprioception. All of these things can occur in microgravity. As a psychiatrist, I'm really concerned about CNS degradation, problems with neurogenesis, problems that in the dentate gyrus of the hippocampus, which is responsible for memory and learning as well. All of these things can occur in microgravity. Some of the psychological challenges that we talked about due to living and working in an isolated and confined environment are very important, because relationships can degrade or they can be built. And we know that, and fortified, we know that with the professional astronaut population, they're assigned to a crew a year out. I spent the last 3 years working with the BHP group at NASA, and it was interesting to work with them when they were first assigned to a mission, because there might have been some personality conflicts or issues. They were an extremely professional group to work with. They worked through all of their training iterations, and they had that year time in all of these training evolutions to bond. And it was interesting to watch them go through that process. It's a different ballgame when we consider the private astronaut world. We're limited in time, and so the selection criteria is different. It's complementary, but it's different. Another challenge to date, if you look at our spacecraft design, it's designed for functionality. It's designed for survivability, right? For individuals to survive rather than form. When we think about potentially a mission to Mars, we think about those long duration missions, we're looking at moving beyond just pure functionality. I'm not making much sense as a psychiatrist saying this, but engineers and architects understand the importance of that, looking more at design that's going to support long-term survival. I apologize to the PowerPoint gods for this slide. I would fail the presentation slide with this slide because there's too much on it. But you've heard the term multi-planetary species thrown out quite a lot. I want you to think about that. Are humans really a multi-planetary species? Not by design. All of our human evolutionary biological adaptation has occurred under specific environmental conditions. If you think about human development, all of our organogenesis, cellular migration, differentiation, and our uniqueness as a species has all been under these specific environmental conditions. In space, when you consider microgravity, another thing we don't really talk about is it teratogenic? In other words, is it deleterious to a developing embryo? DNA damage can occur due to ionizing radiation. We know that there's musculoskeletal problems, vestibular dysfunctions, and disruption of developmental cues. I think there was a study that was done on rat pups that were born in space that showed that they did not develop a system of proprioception because of the problems in microgravity as well. So that's something to consider, and that's part of one of the environmental forces that is peculiar to space, that when we leave our planet, we're subjected to. Also, the Earth's geomagnetic field is protective for cellular growth, development, and provides protection from ionizing radiation. And you also have to consider sustainability. One of the things with the professional astronaut population is, it seems like they are fantastic to work with, incredible, almost like superhuman individuals. However, we keep pushing that limit with regard to a long duration mission. How long is too long? I had the privilege of being involved in Frank Rubio's mission and supporting him on orbit. And he did struggle a lot in the last kind of quarter of his mission. He handled it like a champ, you wouldn't know it. But it takes its toll physically and mentally. And I think as we keep pushing those limits out, we're going to run into more issues, especially when we talk about the non-professional cohort of folks. Psychological kind of concerns, effects of isolation and confinement, certainly delays in communication, not really low Earth orbit or even on the moon. You think of a planetary mission like a mission to Mars, of course, that would be a huge consideration. Sleep and cognitive degradation as well. Developing objective measures for fatigue, I think, is really important. One thing that, I mentioned this in my small group, one thing that kind of puzzled me was there were no kind of measures for sleep debt. And I think of the biomathematical models that exist, like the fatigue avoidance scheduling tool, which is something that could predict sleep debt, which is part of the astronaut's schedule. And I always ask that question when I was there, why hasn't this been implemented? Because this could identify folks who are at risk for fatigue and fatigue-related mistakes as well. So, and also other kind of devices to measure sleep architecture. I think as long as I was at NASA for 3 years, and it seems like we were always kind of battling to get a device like the Aura Ring, as payload. That was an ongoing conversation. So really kind of the reports of sleep are subjective kind of reports. There are no real objective measures as well. And I'm particularly interested in the last bullet, psychiatric and treatment of mental health conditions. We've never treated a mental health condition in space. And you think about the medications that are flown, like on the ISS, antidepressant medications, antidepressants, what do we know about them terrestrially? Well, they can lower the seizure threshold, they can increase the QTC interval, they can also have deleterious effects on bone density, on platelet aggregation. Maybe not the best medications to use in microgravity when multiple bodily systems are degrading in that environment. So I think as we move forward, we're going to have to look at more targeted therapeutics, neuromodulation as well. So I know you're getting hungry. I promise this isn't going to take too long, but I want to talk about a unique variable, Earth attachment. And attachment theory in psychology is, think of an infant and their caregiver. There was a psychiatrist by the name of John Bowlby who pioneered this theory of attachment where the caregiver acts as a secure base and bonds with the caregiver, help a person to develop healthy psychological traits as well. And folks who did not have a secure attachment to their caregiver have problems and issues throughout life. There's also an ecological attachment theory as well, where humans develop this bond with the Earth. If you think about, all of the religious literature, philosophical literature, the Earth is often referred to as Mother Earth as well. We have a unique attachment and bond to the Earth and to changings of seasons, a sense of security and belonging. I thought this might resonate well with the wilderness medicine folks. So Earth attachment. It involves a unique attachment to our planet based on biological and evolutionary bonds that exist under specific environmental conditions. We all developed in 1G. Here, when you change that variable, who knows? We don't know what will happen, but I think it behooves us all to, if we're going to consider longer duration missions, planetary missions, we need to investigate. We need to do research in this area, and I think the starting point for that is we do analog research, which I think is great. I think it's very helpful, but we really have to do this research off planet. I mean, it should be done in low Earth orbit and on the lunar surface when we develop a presence there. But some questions, when we look at all of our missions to date, the Earth is right there, low Earth orbit, the Earth is right there on the moon, the Earth is in the rear view mirror, we're always in visual contact of it. What will happen when our bond with the Earth is severed in deep space? How will this affect factors related to resilience? And what technologies need to be developed to maintain our connection to our planet for survival in deep space? Once again, I apologize for this slide, but some proposed solutions for the physical and physiological and prevention of CNS degradation. Now, my son is hoping to go to an engineering school next year. He's a senior in high school, and he said, "Dad, do not use generation of a gravitational field. The engineers will hate that. Say emulation of a gravitational field." So if we could emulate a gravitational field close to 1G, potentially generate an electromagnetic field similar to Earth's to help prevent, or protect from radiation. That's one proposed solution. Psychological solution, spacecraft design, which incorporates areas that foster connectedness to Earth, like a greenhouse as well. Advanced VR with olfactory stimulation, kinesthetic simulation as well. I heard one veteran astronaut who returned, and I was doing his reintegration kind of work, and I asked him what he missed most about Earth, and he said, the feeling of the wind on my skin, the feeling of rain on my skin, all of these factors as well. So looking ahead at technologies that might connect us with our planet, and advanced VR with other capabilities like this. Just wrote a paper with Molly McCormick on the importance of windows in spacecraft as well. Once again, that visual cue. As humans, we're constantly recalibrating and readjusting to our environment, and that visual connection with Earth is really important. And I mentioned briefly objective measures to obtain real-time sleep data as well, and the biomathematical models are, I think, very, very important and relatively simple to incorporate. And then the development of targeted psychopharmacologic and neuromodulatory methods. There's a device out right now called the Fisher-Wallace stimulator, which is it's a transcranial alternating current stimulation device that you can self-administer, you can wear, and actually is thought to increase synaptic neuroplasticity. So could actually be used to, astronauts now will occasionally use stimulant medications to increase alertness for mission critical tasks. Perhaps this device could help avoid kind of these medications and could stimulate alertness and also be useful for cognitive reserve as well. So that's a thought, moving into the neurostimulation kind of world, neuromodulation for not only cognitive reserve and stimulation, but also potentially for treatment of depression, anxiety, or insomnia. And then we've been talking about CBT modules or psychotherapy modules to provide psychological support on missions as well. And then the last kind of proposed solution is, kind of a biopsychosocial, spiritual kind of approach, looking at spirituality as an important component, for someone. May or may not be, but I think it's important to consider. All right, I'm going to conclude. Way forward conclusions. Life in space beyond survival is going to require new technologies to support, maintain, and sustain human life for deep space. It'll require everyone in this room, a collaborative effort to support extended human presence beyond low Earth orbit. And Earth attachment, or an awareness of that, it encompasses everything that I've talked about, can provide a guide for developing technologies and promoting connectedness to our home planet. All of the above elements will be needed to be addressed to foster and maintain orientation favoring psychological resilience in space. And finally, a lunar habitat or low Earth orbit economy will provide an excellent launching point for continuing research for deep space missions. So that's all I have. Thank you very much for your attention. Questions? Not everybody at once.
So in order to measure cognitive function over time in space, they've used different things like WinSCAT, and they moved to cognition, and then they just published some data saying, look, over the 6-month periods at least, 35 astronauts that they evaluated, they didn't see any significant drop in cognitive function. But they also kind of hedged it with these terms of like, hey, there were some individual things that might be changing that we're just not catching with these things. So when you talk about all of the kind of holistic changes in CNS,
Yeah.
the end point, one of the big outcomes is cognitive function, right? Have you seen, in the time that you've been at NASA, sub-data point anecdotal concerns that like things like the space stupids and other things like that are actually real, or do you think that they're like something from the space environment, or do you think that it's something that is experienced by people in a challenging environment, like extreme ice environments that aren't affiliated with microgravity radiation and those other hazards?
I think that they are. What I see most commonly is during that initial kind of adaptation period on orbit, where you have the hydrostatic fluid shift, and really the testing is, the first kind of iteration of testing is done, at day 30 on orbit, so you're beyond that kind of initial adaptation period. It really varies, and it varies. Where I've seen the most kind of changes in data points are during the kind of the Ironman schedules, where they've had to have these continuous kind of work periods, and I attribute that mainly to fatigue rather than CNS degradation. But I think it's a consequence of life in microgravity. Did I answer your question?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am.
I think the philosophy across time has sort of been like a little bit of a don't ask, don't tell around how much of mental or emotional struggle you're having, because there's just a job to do, and we're all, maybe struggling in our own way, but it's there's a short duration and we're getting it done and all of that. When we think about long term, have you seen a shift behind the scenes about, in terms of selection and the psychological evaluations around the allowance and the acceptability of having the bad day and having the self-awareness and being able to self-report when you're sort of saying, yeah, I'm just in a really crappy mood today, and so everyone just look out, sort of thing. I think there's an allowance that needs to be generated that hasn't been to date. Would you agree with that? And if not, I'd love to hear a conversation about it, but do you think that's something that we can build in culturally going forward?
That's a great question. I've absolutely seen an improvement, especially with I was involved, what was the class before this one was 2020, right? I was involved with selection for that class and the flies. And the flies seem to be very psychologically minded and have even gone to the point where they've asked speakers to come in and talk with their astronaut class about resilience. And one of the things that the behavioral health and performance team did was they embedded a psychologist, with the astronauts on their training kind of events as well. So I think now they're more open to talking about issues as they come up and realizing, like, I think the old school thought was if you admitted to anything happening, that was a career killer. I can tell you some of the, traditionally in the past, the astronauts have kind of fallen into two groups, kind of the flyer astronauts, like the Navy flyers, and the engineering astronauts. And the flyer astronauts were, I can tell you, I had an interview with one when I was new at NASA, and this is how it went down. I was meeting with him as a psychiatrist. I'm not going to tell you who it was. I was meeting with him as a psychiatrist, and he said, "What you got for me, Doc?" And I said, "Oh, well, just checking in with you. How are things going?" "Oh, I'm going great. How you doing?" Doing well. And that was basically the extent of the conversation. Really, he didn't want to talk, couldn't really get anything out of him, and it was kind of like that old school, pilot mentality that I don't want to talk to the doc. I especially don't want to talk to the psychiatrist because they're really going to ground me. So I think we've turned a corner. NASA's done a great job. They've turned a corner there with openness and this astronaut, the last astronaut class, the flies especially, were very psychologically minded. Other questions?
Yeah, I'm impressed at how poorly we can predict the future, right? And so obviously in extremes, you can say somebody's really maladapted and not going to make it. But when we start beginning to now try to select these things in this middle group, can we really do that? Can we predict, like, who's going to decompensate and stress, 6 months, a year down the road, as opposed to, you understand my point? Is that
I do. With the professional astronaut population, those folks, if they have a solid mental health history, they're screened out. In the private astronaut population, it's a different world, and I'm really excited about it because gives us the opportunity to fly individuals who have had, successfully treated mental health problems. Now that also raises some concerns. Pharmacokinetics of medications change, in microgravity, and so those are all considerations that need to be taken very seriously. So we can't predict, but we certainly can, pay closer attention to these if we're going to fly an individual with that history. And I would be, as a psychiatrist, be wanting to check in with them and more frequently to make sure there aren't any issues. But as we write the criteria for the selection for private astronauts, we're looking at ways that pre-flight, if we see them struggling in certain areas, we can try and do some coaching with them to optimize performance, so that we can be pretty assured that they are going to fly with no issues. The other piece with the private astronaut population is they will be flying with an experienced flyer as well, and really won't be involved with any mission critical tasks.
And also in the future, what kind of world are we going to create by this, right? Allowing some people to go to Mars and other people not go to Mars, and it's sort of bias selection.
Well, I think we have a lot of work to do before we even consider Mars. just developing technologies to allow people to survive for longer periods of time and thrive psychologically in space. Question back there?
Just quickly, I didn't want to hold up for lunch. Can you talk about resilience of the individual? And I wonder about resilience among teams, since we talk about teams. And I know many of us, if we have a great leader who leads us well, we can be more resilient. If we have, say, a chairman who's not so great or whatever, our resilience may not be as prime all the time. How do you think about resilience, not by the individual, but among teams that will be flying on the cruise?
Really important question as well, and I think that the crew makeup and considering crew composition, that's very important. And once you have a group, a cohort, observing them closely on sims and training exercises to look at who might emerge as a leader, who is a follower. Are they happy in those roles as well? Do they function well as a team, assuming those roles, or are there red flags as well? So that is an important point. Thank you.